Today I'm going to show you how to join 36 blocks together, quilt as you go, using my easy cover strip method. My easy cover strip method is fully machine sewn and can be used on the front or back of a quilt. With this quilt I'm going to put it on the back, so there's no interruption between the blocks, giving it a traditional look. All these blocks are stitch and flip and quilt as you go. You can use whatever blocks you like. I have a playlist with all of these blocks so you can use them as a repetitive design, or you can mix and match them to make your own quilt. Or if you have your own designs that you want to use, this method is suitable for applique blocks or any blocks that don't have points that finish a 1/4 inch away from the edge. If you have blocks like this, you can easily add a border before you quilt and join the blocks, just like I've done with this quilt here. I've made many quilts with this method in all different sizes and configurations. You can check them out on our website. We have lots of PDF patterns and even some ebooks. So stick around and I'll show you how it's done. Welcome back to Pattern Poole TV. If you're new here, I'm Monica, and every week my daughter and I make videos about how we make our quilt as you go quilts. So we're really excited today to join our 36 blocks together, but first of all, let's talk about the tools and the fabric that we're going to need to do this. So you'll need your basic patchwork and quilting supplies. So you'll need your cutting mat, your ruler, rotary cutter. We're going to square up our blocks, so if you've got a square ruler, that'd be quite handy, something that's around 10 inches. This is my regular one, which is 12.5 inches. If you don't have a square ruler, a sheet of template plastic or some plastic that's see-through and you can cut it with your scissors. So I'm going to show you how to make up a template. You'll also need a fabric marking pencil or texter. This one here is a water-soluble fabric eraser. I have to wipe this off with water before I iron it. Otherwise it could set with the iron. They're quite good though, but just be careful with that. A 1-inch bias maker, that's also the same as 25 millimeters. Optional fabric glue, you'll need your scissors, and for the cover strips, just some regular width patchwork cotton quilting fabric. I'm actually going to be using a pre-made bias. So this one here is 100% cotton, and you can see that the raw edges meet on the center back like that. So that's fine to use. Avoid using thin polyester pre-made bias where the edges don't meet on the back, because they'll end up being see-through and you'll just see the seam through it. So although we're using a 1-inch or 25 millimeter bias maker, the strips don't have to be cut on the bias grain. They can be cut across the fabric from selvage to selvage. Mine are only on the bias because I'm just using this pre-made bias. And if you're joining in with our free quilt as you go along, the requirements list is on our blog post. And if you're using this method to make your own quilt, it's just a matter of putting pen to paper and working out how many strips of fabric you're going to need to cover all of your raw seams. So here's an example of how you would work out how much fabric you need for your cover strips. Draw up your quilt plan. Let's say, for instance, our blocks are going to be 10 inches. So we've got 6 blocks across. So 10 times 6 is 60 inches. And we've got 6 blocks down, so 10 times 6 is also 60 inches. Now work out how many strips or how many seams are actually going to be covered with a cover strip. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 5 multiplied by 60 equals 300 inches. And then the same this way. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So same thing, 5 times 60 inches equals 300 inches. So let's add that up. That's going to be 600 inches. That's how much fabric we're going to need, or the length of our cover strips. So now our cover strips are cut across the fabric from selvage to selvage, and your regular width fabric is about 42 inches to 44 inches. So I like to work it out on 40 inches. This allows for my selvages and a little bit of trimming. So we're going to say 600 divided by 40, and that equals 15. So we basically are going to need 15 strips of fabric to give us the 600 inches. So our strips are 2 inches wide. So 15 multiplied by 2 equals 30 inches. And then from there, I like to add an extra strip. So I'm going to add an extra 2 inches onto that. So that's going to be 32 inches. And then what I do is I get my tape measure and I'll say, okay, so here's 32, and I think I might just round that up to 36 inches. So that is actually a yard of fabric. And if you are in a country where we use metric, just flip the tape measure over and you could say 90 centimeters. So that's the amount of fabric that you're going to need to make all of your cover strips. Now with our quilt that we're making, our quilt as you go along quilt, we're actually going to add a picket edge around, and the raw seam of the picket edge is covered up with a cover strip. So I just need to work out how much fabric I need to go all the way around the edge. So I've got 60 inches, so 1, 2, 3, 4. So working out down here, 4 multiplied by 60 inches equals 240 inches divided by 40 inches, which is the width of our fabric, and that will give me 6. So I'm going to need 6 2-inch strips. So I say 6 multiplied by 2 inches equals 12 inches, and I always like to add that extra strip, so an extra 2 inches, so plus 2 inches equals 14 inches. So once again, I just grab my tape measure, and here's 14 inches here. You may want to just take it up to 18 inches and make it half a yard, or flip it over to the other side, 45 centimeters. So now I'm going to show you how to make your cover strips. Fold your fabric over with the selvage edges aligned, and then fold it in half again so that the folded edge is nice and level with our selvage edge. This just makes it a little bit easier to cut. Line up the folded edge on your cutting mat. Just move the raw fabric end over so that it's going to be a little bit past the marked line there, or the line on our cutting mat. Align the line on the cutting mat with your ruler and trim off the edge. And now we're going to cut some strips that are 2 inches wide. So for this quilt, we need to cut 15 2-inch wide strips, but for today's demonstration, I'm just going to cut 2. Open out your strips and make sure that they're nice and straight. So some strips you're going to need to join because the seam is too long. So to join them, what you'll do is place one strip on your cutting mat with the right side facing up in a horizontal direction. Then place your next strip on top with the right side facing down in a vertical direction. So just have the selvage extending past each other there. And then if you mark a diagonal line that goes from the inside corner to the outer corner like that, then you can head to the machine and stitch on that marked line. So when you open that out, you'll see that it goes in a nice straight line. So trim back to a 1/4 inch seam allowance and press the seam open. And trim away the excess corners. Okay, so this is how you use a bias maker. First of all, we're going to cut the end of a strip to a little point like this. And then we're going to, with the wrong side of the fabric facing up, we're going to thread it through the bias maker like this. Use a little pin to help slide it out like that. Okay, so I like to just first of all iron the end. So I'm folding those ends in. Well, the edges are folding over and meeting. Just give that a little press. I've actually got my iron set on steam at the moment, which is totally fine when you're making bias. And now what I like to do is hold my bias maker up on a 45-degree angle. I slide it along like that, and then I bring the iron onto it. And I work in 10 centimeter or 4-inch lengths at a time. And this is how we maneuver over a seam. Pull out like that, double check that your seams are still facing in, and then just press that little bit manually, and away we go again. And an extra tip is our strip is going to have a little bit of stretch in it because it's cut across the grain. So it's going to stretch while you're sewing it anyway, so just pull on that and give it a really good stretch from the front, just to remove any excess stretch. If you did this on a 45-degree angle, don't do the extra stretch. It might just stretch forever.
What do you mean by 45-degree angle?
If somebody cut their fabric on the 45-degree, the bias grain, that little extra stretching tip is actually not if you did, for instance, cut your fabric on the bias grain. I do recommend cutting across from selvage to selvage. There really is no need to cut your fabric on the bias grain. It would just stretch too much. So roll your bias up on a cardboard roll while you're waiting to use it.
Innovative.
It is. Before we join our blocks together, we need to trim them. These blocks all started off at 10 inches square, and we cut the batting half an inch smaller all the way around the edge. This is to reduce the bulk in the seam allowance. The half-inch gap allows for a bit of shrinkage, a bit of shifting, and a little bit of trimming. When I stitch and flip the blocks, they shrunk in slightly by about 1/8 of an inch, so I'm going to trim them all back to 9 3/4 inches square. So if you have a square ruler, you can place it on top and, using the lines on the ruler, trim an even amount away from the edge of each block, making sure that everything is as centered and as straight as possible. I normally trim up the side and across the top, and then rotate the block and position my 9 3/4 inch line on the straight side and bottom edge, and then trim the remaining edges. So this is now going to leave me with a 3/8 of an inch gap of batting, and it's okay if this is not exact and some of the batting gets caught in the seam. It's just really good to not have the batting go all the way through the seam, which will make the seam bulky. If you don't have a square ruler, you can make a square ruler using some template plastic. To make a 9 3/4 inch square, start with a straight corner of the template plastic. Using a fine tip permanent marker, measure and mark 9 3/4 inches from the side and across the top. Make sure the lines are nice and straight, and then mark diagonal lines from corner to corner and mark your center vertical and horizontal lines. Now cut out with some scissors, but don't use your good fabric scissors. Make sure that the marker is dry before using the template on your fabric. I'm going to start off by trimming the center blocks, as I want to make sure that the side corners of the star line up from block to block. So to do this, I placed my template on top and I made a mark at the side corners of the stars. I double checked that it was the same on all of them. I was then able to easily line that mark up at the star corners and mark around my template. Once I marked around the template, I was then able to use a ruler to cut the edges straight. If you don't have a square ruler, you can use your regular patchwork ruler. Please don't use a rotary cutter with a thin template, as you could easily slip and cut your finger. I cut all my center blocks in the same way, and that way I could be happy with the fact that I knew that they were all going to line up at those corners. So I also marked some extra lines around the edge of my template using my permanent marker. I marked the first line, which is 1 1/8 away from the edge, and I did this on all 4 sides. And then I came back and marked another line that was 1 3/8 of an inch away from the edge on all 4 sides. That actually helped me when I was cutting out blocks like the tree block. I was able to line up the inner marked line with the border seam line. Just line it up as best as you can. It might not be perfect, but that will be fine, and you will see that we'll be trimming an even amount off around the edge of each block. So for the retro flower block, I was able to use the outer marked line to line up on the border seam line. So go ahead and trim all of your blocks ready to join together. So before I start to join my blocks together, I've already jumped ahead and I've joined the top section of my quilt together. Now what I'm going to do is I've got 2 rows left to join. I'm going to show you how I join those together. So in my last video, I worked on every row separately, and then I sewed on the cover strips, and then I joined those rows together. But I'm always working on how I do things. I like to perfect my methods all the time. So this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to join my rows together separately. Then I'm going to join 2 rows together before I start sewing on the cover strips. So let's get started and I'll show you how I'm going to do that. Okay, so I have my row of blocks lined up, ready to join together, and I have my machine all set up with a neutral color thread, top and bottom, and I'm just using my standard foot. You can actually use your walking foot if you want to, but the seam allowance is 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter, and you'll see why when we go to press them, that wider seam always sits nice and flat and open, and it's also the reason why we say it doesn't really suit blocks where the points finish 1/4 inch away from the edge. But as we said, you can add a border around the edge just to overcome that problem. And I'm using a stitch length of 3 and a size 80 quilting needle. So let's get started. So take your first 2 blocks and place them with the right sides facing. You can pin them if you like, but if you feel confident enough, you can just sew them. And we're just going to sew them with our 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and make sure you do a little reverse stitch at the beginning and at the end so that our rows of stitching are nice and secure. So make sure you don't get confused, and make sure that all your blocks end up facing the correct way. And another tip is, when you're sewing, even if you feel that your foot wants to kind of push away because we've got the ridges that are formed by the batting, try and stay on that 1 centimeter seam allowance as best as possible. That's quite important to do. And it's totally fine if some of the batting is caught in the seam, and that's why we use a nice flat low loft batting. So there's one row, and now I'm going to join my next row together just in the same way. I actually have it all facing the right way so I don't get confused, which I feel like I'm confused already. All right, so this time what I'm going to do, so work out your own procedure and how you want to join them together. There's no rhyme or reason to it, just whatever works for you. So this time I think I'm going to work them in pairs, just so that I don't lose where I'm up to. So here's another tip. When you go to sew 2 blocks together, just stretch on the edge of each block. And the one that doesn't stretch, put that one on top, because that's going to stabilize our underneath stretchy block. And it means that instead of sewing with the stretchy block on top, where it ends up being a little bit too long, as I said, the top one, the non-stretchy one, is going to stabilize the stretchy one. To summarize, just sew with the non-stretchy one on top, because that's going to stabilize the stretchy one that's underneath.
Nailed it.
Bird on that side, fan on that side.
Which one's your favourite block?
The bird.
Why?
Oh, it's just really pretty. What's your favourite block?
Flower.
The one you wanted. There.
One dusty looking line.
So now you can see our blocks look nice and neat on the front, and on the back we have our raw seam that we're now going to press open and nice and flat, and I'm going to join that onto the other row before we start applying the cover strips. even if we have a little bit of the batting caught in the seam, that's totally fine, and it just means that it's great not having the batting going all the way through the seam allowance, because it just does reduce that bulk in the seam. So in the last video, I applied the cover strips over the raw seams at this stage, but in this video, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to join the 2 rows together. So I'm going to take them and I'm going to put them right sides together. And I'm just going to pin and make sure that all of those seams line up, and then I'm going to sew my seam, press it open before I start applying the cover strips. Here's another tip: just before you pin, trim any unlevel edges so that they're nice and level before we start joining our 2 edges together.
Nice.
So here are my 2 rows right sides together, and I just want to pin those seams so they're going to line up exactly. So just pop your pin in about 1/4 inch away from the edge in the stitching line, or right in the center of that seam, and then do the same on the underneath piece. Squeeze those 2 edges together. Just double check that it's actually coming through. Yep, that's right, and then bring it down and back up through the stitching line again. So they're going to line up exactly. Okay, so now just sew the 2 rows together. So if sometimes it seems like the fabric is too big on top, you can either just hold it from behind, like that, or use a tailor's awl to help ease the top fabric so that it fits against the bottom fabric. And very carefully sew across the pins, or slide them out before you get to them.
So you're just constantly adjusting.
Yep, as I sew, yep. And when it gets to a point, if it seems like I need to ease, I just use the tailor's awl. Now press the seam open of the long join. Now the reason why I decided to join 2 rows together is because these are only small blocks. So if I was making a quilt that had large blocks, I would probably still just stick with joining 1 row together at a time. So now what's going to happen is we're going to stitch these cover strips on to cover up the raw seam, but to make sure that they are sewn on perfectly straight and even, I'm going to mark a line that is positioned 1/2 inch away from the seam on both sides of the seam. So I'm using this blue washout marker because I wanted something that would show up in the camera, and so I could easily see it myself. It's really important that these lines are actually nice and accurate. And the reason for that is that we want these stitching lines to line up from row to row. And when you're marking, always angle your marker in towards the ruler so that the line doesn't grow. So I'm going to mark this line onto every seam now. So the next bit is that we want our cover strips to start 1/2 inch away from the beginning and 1/2 inch away from the end. And this reduces the bulk in the crossways seams. And a lot of people find that a bit unusual to begin with, but you'll see that by the time you sew the seam, press the seam open and apply the cover strip, the end of that cover strip is actually covered. But another thing that you need to consider is how do you want to finish off the edge of your quilt? So if you do want to just finish it here and put a binding on it, make your cover strip go all the way to the outer edge of the quilt. But if you want to add a border, say for instance using this same technique, start the cover strip 1/2 inch away from the edge. But if you want to do a border using my easy border technique, you can also make the cover strip go all the way to the edge. So it's just a matter of thinking about what you want to do. We're actually finishing our quilt with the picket border, the same way that we did with our cherry cheek quilt. That's our little pointy edge. So I am going to finish my cover strip 1/2 inch away from the edge to do that. So I'm going to actually mark 1/2 inch away from the edge, just so that I don't forget. So now I'm just going to sew my cover strip on, and I'm going to start it where my 1/2 inch mark is. And you can see I'm just going to position it in the center of my marked lines, finishing 1/2 inch away from the edge. Now, if you want, you can actually hold this in place with some fusible web like I have done in this video here, which I'll put a link in the description for you to see. I've also done this where I've used some fabric glue to hold it in place. But you know what, recently I've just found that it's really easy just to hold it in place and sew. And I'm going to show you how I do that now. That's our iron, don't worry about that. I just said to Laura, don't get my little needle stash in. I don't know why I keep them. I probably should throw them out if they're blunt. Put them in my little sharps container.
She's a hoarder. I think it's a good spot.
It is.
It's built for it.
It is. It's magnetic too.
Is it?
Yeah. That's why they all stay there. That's why
Maybe it's meant for that.
That's why I'm tempted to put them there.
Just like magic.
It is. To sew the cover strips on, I'm going to use an edge stitching foot. Some of you may have a stitch in the ditch attachment that goes with your walking foot. You can use that if you like. I'm just going to use my edge stitching foot. And what I do is I just move my needle position over so that the distance from the guide to the cover strip, it gives me about a 2mm or a 1/16 of an inch space. So I don't have to worry about watching where I'm sewing. I just line up the guide and I just sew away. It makes it very, very easy to do. Also, when it comes to the thread, try and choose a thread that is going to blend in with all of your fabrics. I've just kind of chosen this mottly variegated thread to tie in, and it looks quite good with the fabric on the back and also the fabric on the front. Okay, so now I'm just moving my needle position over so that I've got that distance there. And when I start to sew, I want to start and finish with a little reverse stitch, which is very close to the beginning and the end. And those little reverse stitches will actually get caught into the seam, so we won't see them on the top of the quilt and it won't look messy. So, and then I'm just going to hold my cover strip in place in between my marked lines, and I'm just going to sew. And another thing is that I've got my work rolled up, ready to start sewing, and I'm going to show you my process in how I sew on these cover strips. And also I forgot to mention that I have a stitch length of 3. Sometimes I cut my cover strips to length. This time I'm just going to cut them as I go. So I'll roll up this side and unroll this side here. So I'm going to sew all the way down one side of my cover strip, and then I'll turn it around and come back the other way. So this is what it looks like from the back so far. We have our raw seams covered this way. We've still got our raw seams exposed here. So we've got to sew our cover strip on there. But this is what it looks like from the front. So those stitching lines that attach the tram, they just end up looking like stitching lines that are sewn 1/2 inch away from the seam on the front of the quilt. So now we're going to prepare to sew our crossways strip on, and I'm just going to mark that line that is 1/2 inch away from the seam on both sides of the center of the seam. So now back at the machine and sewing our crossways cover strip on just in the same way. So it's just a matter of sewing a little bit, adjust, sew a little bit and adjust, and just make sure that your quilt can freely move through the machine just to give you a consistent stitch length. And scrape any frayed edges under the cover strip. And now I'm just turning around so I can sew down the other side. So here's another tip. This is how I hold my quilt to help maneuver it through. I'll just put one hand underneath like this, and then I hold it straight with the other hand. So as I mentioned, the stitching lines just look like quilting lines sewn 1/2 inch away from the seam on the front of the quilt. And this is what it looks like from the back. So with this quilt, I just used fabrics from my stash, so I really didn't plan anything out for the back. But if you really did plan it, you could make this quilt reversible too. Okay, so that's the process on how you join 2 rows together. So with this quilt, you're going to repeat this process 3 times. So we're going to have our 3 separate sections, which will then join together. So as I mentioned, I've already joined 2 sections together. So now all I have to do is join this section on to complete my quilt. Okay, so I've laid my sections out, and I just wanted to point out that what we really need to line up now are our seams and also the stitching lines, and also just these little knotty bits here where we did our reverse at the beginning and at the end. They will actually get hidden in the seam. So now pin the seams in the same way. We want our seams to definitely line up. So just like that. But what I'm also going to do is pin my stitching lines. You could just wing it, but I want to make sure it's going to line up perfectly. So I pin through my stitching line and through my stitching line on this side, and pinning back through like that, just double checking that it's all lined up. So I'm actually doing 3 pins on each seam. And I'm going to pin every seam the same. So all pinned together, and now it's just a matter of sewing that 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam again. Very carefully sew across the pins or slide them out just before you get to them. So open out and double check that all of your seams and stitching lines are lining up as best as they can. And if everything's okay, press the seam open. So here you can see where we finished that cover strip 1/2 inch away from the edge, that it's going to be hidden and covered underneath our cover strip that goes acrossways. So mark up the 1/2 inch lines and sew on the cover strip in the same way. So I did at the beginning of this video mention some fabric glue, so you can actually use some fabric glue to hold the cover strips in place. I have also in the past used fusible web. So I do have some other videos showing quilts where I've made using glue and fusible web. So I'll get Laura to put some little cards on the screen so that you can click on those videos and check out how I did that. So it's all about working out the way that you feel comfortable in sewing on the cover strips. So I'm just going to head to the machine and get our last strip sewn on. But before I do that, I'm going to roll the quilt up. So this is my big edge here, and I'm actually going to roll this up, and that's going to help it to slide through the machine as I sew the strip on. So I'm just going to continue holding my cover strip in place while I sew. And as your quilt grows, it's just about making sure that you're holding it in a way that it can easily maneuver through the sewing machine without it pulling on it. And so it's just a matter of making sure that it can freely move through the sewing machine without it being restricted. So that's when your stitches end up looking small. So we want to try and have a consistent stitch length. So I use my left hand to hold the cover strip in place, and my right hand is underneath the quilt, holding the weight of it so that it can move through freely. Just give it a little hand as it goes over the bumps of the seam. Just working a little bit at a time.
do you also use your tailor's awl?
I do, in places where there's threads that are poking out, or if I just need to hold it nice and straight in place, definitely.
So like if I was going to make my first quilt, I would probably glue it down.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Although try working in the smaller sections without glue, because it actually isn't that hard at all.
Give me a go.
Do you want to go?
Yeah.
All right. Come on, over here then.
Oh, okay. So
Not that hard?
well, I just think that you make everything look really easy all the time.
That's true, because I've been
But-
doing it for so long. I know, look at you go.
Okay, ready? I'm going to go over a bump.
All right,
This
just
is the real test.
take it slow.
Oh, I'm a little bit hooked.
Are you? Oh, good.
It's a little bit fun.
Watch out, everybody. Alora could be making her first quilt pretty soon.
Is my sewing good? Come check it.
Very good. Great. That could be our next video. Alora makes a quilt.
How's my sewing?
Very good. Very nice. Nice and straight, you stayed on track. See, that guide makes it really easy, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it does.
Okay, so now to sew the other side. So we're just spinning it. I like to keep it rolled up because it just makes it easier to move through your machine rather than the weight of the machine dragging on the table. And then I also like to roll up the inside edge too. Get away. Get away. I was being strangled by bias. And you'll always find that it's the holding it on and sewing the first side, which is the trickier side, which really wasn't that tricky, was it? And the second side always just sews so easily without a problem. Okay, I'm gonna scrape my few little threads underneath, use your awl or your scissors, and away we go. And here's our quilt all joined together. This is what it looks like from the back. And I just used all different fabrics on the back. I actually just winged it, and I'm really happy with how that looks. It's so cute and colourful. And this is what it looks like on the front. So when you're joining your quilt together, if you like, you can put the cover strips on the front. Some people have done that. Be aware though that you will have less of the block showing on the front, but that's totally fine. It's just a completely different look. And we'll be back in our next video showing how I'm going to do the picket edge around it, and that's just going to finish this quilt off and look really cute. But don't forget, what I said was, if you just want to finish your quilt off with a binding, make sure that your cover strips go all the way to the outer edges, and you can finish it off with a normal binding, and then you're finished. So thanks for watching, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
There's my part. Got a little bit jagged.
But it still looks good. No, it looks totally fine. There's so much to look at in this quilt that if something's not perfectly straight, you know, nobody's going to notice it. There's, as I said, there's just so much going on, so much to look at.
I think I want to make a quilt.
Okay, let's do it.